All right, so let's talk about Chapter 2, which is everyone's favorite topic, research methods. Yay! But seriously, research methods are very important. And of course, they're particularly important in abnormal psychology, just like the other disciplines of psychology. Um, I'm going to try to do this in the most effective way for this class. I want to just start off talking to you about the scientific method. I hope for you that this conversation is very much a review. I hope that you've been learning about the scientific method since at least middle school. But I wanted to point out a couple points in the process. Um, Remember that when you're starting to do a study, you don't just jump right in. You first have to gather information, right? So where we are gathering information at this point in your careers, you should really be looking to the literature, right? So you should be looking at scientific journals and seeing what other experts in the field have to say about the topic that you're interested in studying. Then from there, you can kind of identify a question, kind of in the realm of what you're interested in studying. And then we can create a hypothesis, which, as we know, is a specific testable prediction, which you can find empirical evidence to support or refute. And then, of course, in order to gather that evidence, you have to collect data. In other words, you have to do an experiment. Once you have done your experiment, you have some results that you can't just stop with. You have to analyze those results. You have to interpret what they mean. First, you might do some statistical analyses, and then you have to kind of say, okay, what do these statistical analyses mean? So then you have to draw conclusions. And then, we're still not done. We ideally would retest our study, we'd replicate the experiment to make sure the results that we have are reliable and consistent. And then, at that point, we might be sort of publishing that study, those findings. But in order for that information to kind of take hold in the scientific community, ideally other people would also be replicating your study, and we would be having converging evidence to support the ideas that you found. And if lots and lots of people have been able to find the same type of thing that you have, then maybe possibly we can come to what's called a theory. And a theory is something that integrates results of lots and lots of studies. But it takes a really long process for this whole thing to happen. But let's talk about some of the nuances of what's happening when we're conducting a study. But first of all, let's talk about why research is performed in the first place. So why the heck would you want to do research? Well, there are two major reasons why you might want to do research. And of course, these are very broad. But the first reason that you might want to do research is to describe something, to describe a phenomenon. So you just sort of say, hey, this thing is happening. Let me tell you all about it, okay? The other reason we might do research is we want to say why something happens. We want to explain something. And so when you are doing when you're answering these types of questions, these two different reasons for doing research, those two types of things are going to require different procedures. So in order to describe something, you have to do certain things. To explain something, you have to do a little bit different type of thing. So let's talk about a few different types of studies that are just describing. Okay. The first and most basic type of research study that is not explaining, it is simply describing, is a case study. Okay, so case studies are very in-depth studies of a single individual or a small group of individuals. So you are saying a whole lot about this individual. You are just sort of describing what's happening with that individual. Of course, because they're so descriptive, they can be very informative and they're going to be really, really in depth. The reason that we might use a case study as opposed to other types of studies oftentimes would be things like we want to describe sort of an unusual case. So, for example, if you found that an individual was exhibiting a certain, some behavioral patterns that you've never seen before. Maybe they have a new psychological disorder that has yet to be documented. So if that's the case, then you'd want to give all the details you could about this single individual. And you might not have the opportunity to include more individuals in your study because they don't exist or you haven't discovered that they do yet. So rare cases, unusual cases, that there aren't a whole lot of individuals that display that type of pattern are going to be kind of what you might use for a case study. Case studies, of course, because you're just looking at a single individual, they can be very subjective because there's not a lot of control for cause and effect. Because there's so many factors that are going on, you're not really controlling anything in a case study. So they have what we call low internal validity, and we will talk a little bit more about low internal validity in just a few minutes. But case studies are not very strong. They in general, as a type of research design, they're very subjective, and we also can't make a whole lot of generalizations from case studies because we're just looking at one single individual or a very small number of individuals. It's hard to make generalizations about the rest of the population. And that's a concept that we're going to talk about again more, called low external validity. So how what you're doing in your study applies to other situations. All right, so case studies are your sort of most basic type of research study. It's really just going to describe something, but it's not saying, so it's kind of saying, hey, this pattern is happening, but we don't know why. We're just telling you, hey, this is what's happening. Isn't it interesting? Correlational studies, on the other hand, are looking at the relationship between two different variables. So you have two variables of interest. You are trying to see if you can establish some trends about one of the variables based on the other. Okay, so let's say you wanted to know if playing violent video games causes aggression in children, but you couldn't really manipulate whether the kids played violent video games. So you simply asked them, how many hours do you spend playing violent video games? And maybe you found that the more hours those kids reported playing violent video games, the higher their levels of aggression were. So if that's the case, we have what's called a positive correlation. So positive correlation is what happens when a trend exists in such a way that as one of the variables increases, the other variable also increases. Alternatively, you could describe it by saying as one of the variables decrease, the other variable also decreases. So the two variables are going in the same direction. If, on the other hand, you saw that the more hours kids spent playing violent video games, the less aggressive behavior they themselves displayed, you'd have number of hours playing violent video games going up and aggression going down. So those two things are going in opposite directions. So that's what we call a negative correlation. And then you might find that there's not a clear trend, there's not a clear relationship between either of those variables. In that case, we would have what's called a zero correlation. And so that just means that, again, there's not really a clear pattern of connection between those two things. Correlational studies, all they do is allow researchers to observe these trends and make predictions about these relationships. It does not mean that one of the variables causes a change in the other. These are some graphs depicting those different types of relationships. Excuse me, so the graph on the left is showing a positive correlation. So as the variable x is increasing, so is variable y. Alternatively, as variable x is decreasing, variable y is also decreasing. The one in the middle shows a negative correlation, so as one variable is going up, the other is going down. And the third frame in that panel is showing that there's not a clear relationship, there's not a clear linear relationship between these two variables. Just because two variables are correlated with each other does not mean that one of those variables caused a change in the second variable. All right, so here's the deal. Going back to the violent video games example, the reason that just based on those parameters that we've set up, if we simply asked kids, how many hours do you spend playing video games, violent video games, and we also measure their aggression levels, there could be a causal relationship that exists. If, like, let's say we found that the more hours they spend playing violent video games, the higher their aggression levels. It could mean that violent video games causes aggressive behavior. But we cannot know that simply with a correlational study because we, as the experimenter, have not actually manipulated anything. There could be so many other factors playing a role here. We could have what's called a selection bias. It could be that for whatever reason, the individuals that we've selected in our sample are differently affected by violent video games than the rest of the population. So we might have a selection bias. Maybe we have kids that are really sensitive to messages on TVs and to TV and video. So maybe they're not representative of everybody else. We could also have what's called a directionality problem. It could be that violent video games cause a change in aggression. So variable A causes a change in variable B, in other words. On the other hand, it could be that kids that are more aggressive to begin with are drawn to violent video games, so it could be that variable B causes a change in variable A. Also, it could be that some third variable that we've not measured, in this case, is independently causing a change in both variable A and B. So for example, it could be that something like loneliness is causing kids to play more violent video games. Could also be that loneliness is additionally causing a change in aggressive behavior. So because we don't have a lot of control, because we haven't controlled all these other things, kept the other things constant, we cannot possibly know that just the way that we've studied it here, which one of these factors is causing this change, okay? The example that I like to use, and I apologize if you've been in my other classes and you've heard this over and over again, a famous example of the third variable problem is this correlation that we see. There's a very strong positive correlation between ice cream sales and violent crimes. So we have seen over and over again, as ice cream sales increase, so too do the number of violent crimes. Now, does this mean that people who sell ice cream are really bad at their jobs and people are going out and committing violent crimes against them? Maybe. So it could be that ice cream sales increases are causing an increase in violent crimes. That's one explanation. But it could equally be true that that violent crimes are causing an increase in ice cream sales. So it could be that people who are committing violent crimes are going out and celebrating their violent crimes with a delicious ice cream. Just about as possible as the other one, but it's probably not the real answer. And in fact, there is a third variable that's at play here, which is the variable of temperature. As temperature increases, people want to buy more ice cream. So as temperature goes up, so too do ice cream sales. Also, as temperature goes up, violent crimes increase. So temperature is causing both ice cream sales to increase and violent crimes to increase independently of each other. So there's a similar finding with birth control and electrical appliances. The third variable there is socioeconomic status. I'll let you figure that one out for yourselves. But here's a nice graphic about the directionality and third variable problem in a nice little graphic there. I'm going to stop this video here and we'll get to some special types of correlational research as well as some other types of studies in the next video.